Welcome back, everyone. In this video, what we're going to do is we are going to introduce in Redux Persist. Now, Redux Persist is a tool that allows us to persist our reducer values inside of local storage. So to start, what we need to do is we need to add in Redux Persist as a library. So once it's inside, there's a lot of nuanced setup and configuration we have to do. Not a lot, but at least there's some that won't make a lot of sense upright until we actually see it in action. So in order to use it, what we need to do is we have to import in two things from Redux Persist. We have to import in first the actual persist store method from Redux Persist like this. And then the other thing we need is persist reducer. These are the two methods that will help us actually set up our persistence. We need a configuration object that tells Redux Persist what we want. Now, this config is relatively straightforward, and you can find what other values you can set inside of the docs that I've linked for Redux Persist. But here in our current config object, we need to say, okay, what's the key? So the key is the part that we want to start with. And root just says, I want you to persist the whole thing, which is what we want. We want to start from the root level. Then, as far as the storage, what do we want to store this into? So here, we need to import this in from Redux Persist /lib/storage. So by default, in any web browser, this will just use local storage, which is what we want. So this is what we'll pass as the storage value, like so. Except using this shorthand where we cast the variable as the key name. And then what we need is we need to think about whether we want to blacklist or whitelist any of these reducer values. So here, this is where you would put in an array of strings of the actual values that you don't want for which reducer you don't want to persist. For us, we know that our user value is coming from our auth state listener anyways. So if that's the case, we probably don't want to persist the user, because this might conflict and clash with local storage in a way where we get some weird interactive behavior we may not want. So I'm just going to blacklist the user. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want to create a persisted reducer using this persist config. So I'm going to call persist reducer like so. And here I'm going to pass it two things. First is the persist config, and then the next thing is the root reducer. With these two now, I have created a persisted reducer, which is what I want to use for my store. So now my store is by default going to be using persisted reducer. And then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to export out a persister object, which calls persist store using the store object. So it's using these new modified persisted values that we have in Redux that we can now persist the store. But to do so, we have to actually go into our index.js, and we need to import the component that we're going to pass all of this to. So here, what we're going to import in is this thing called a persist gate. So I'm going to import in persist gate, which is a component specifically from Redux Persist that we can use for React. So this lies under Redux Persist, not React, /integration/React, like this. Now this component we want to wrap inside of our provider. And we want to wrap all of our application inside of our new persist gate. And what we pass to persist gate is our persister that we are now exporting from this file. So I'm going to say persister is equal to persister. And now if we go back to our application, if we have looking inside of our cart, we have some items. Let's refresh now. What we see is that we have retained the same items. And looking inside of our code here, we see that we receive an action of type Redux persist or persist/persist, and then persist/rehydrate. So here, this rehydrate, as you can see, is giving us back the actual values that we told it to persist. Remember, we said don't persist the actual user. And through this, we're now able to actually retain the initial state that the user previously had. If we remove some values and then we refresh again, we see that we are persisting the same values. One additional thing you can also add to this persist gate is you can pass a loading value. And here you just renders something. You can pass it a component or whatever you want when it's trying to determine how long it takes to actually rehydrate the store. So if I say null, essentially what happens is that it'll render nothing until persist is actually finished. But there we go. Now we have in local storage and persistence so that you can carry your actual state across multiple sessions. And this is, again, one of the benefits we get out of Redux is that the ecosystem for Redux has a lot of these solutions and tools already solved. You most likely want to use Redux when you're building a large application that has really large state and really complex state. If you don't need a lot of these optimizations, then just use Context API is enough. But now we've migrated the entire application to Redux, and this is pretty much a lot of what you need in Redux. It's just these same patterns over and over again. A lot of practice will go a long way. So at this point, you can continue to learn Redux by either building in new features yourself, or you can try and convert this application back to context. By doing so, you'll actually think about these mappings and all of these different logical decisions that we made in order to architect the application this way. So there's a lot of different ways that you can learn. Again, practice always makes perfect. But now that you're armed with the knowledge, at least you'll know what to do. Redux is one of those things that naturally, again, has a steep learning curve that will only get easier the more you practice. But that's it. We have in our Redux Persist, we have Redux, and now you have seen what it takes in order to set up Redux as your state management service inside of a React application.